Welcome again. In this panel we talk about the Iraqi process. We have three presentations. We started from Dr. Nigas, after that Ozion and Anne. Now we started with Nigas, please.
Good afternoon. So there is a change actually in the title of my paper. It's actually Nouri al-Maliki's legacy and the intricate crisis of the Iraqi political system. So I will focus on actually talking about the nature of the Iraqi political system and will focus on the period of 2010 to 2014. 2010 to 2014, yes. Recently, Iraq named a new prime minister, the prominent Shia politician Haidar al-Abadi, who faces the colossal challenge of both preventing any further disintegration of the Iraqi state and improving the relations between the various social and confessional groups in the country. Many are asking whether he will be able to overcome those daunting challenges that he's facing and whether he can bring peace and reconciliation to the country. While the ouster of Nouri al-Maliki was certainly a good and necessary step forward, it's important to underline that the root of Iraq's problems lies really in the nature of its political system, which has become extremely corrupt and absolutely not transparent. Since the destruction of the institutions of the state in 2003, Iraq has fared very negatively in the state-building process. So this paper examines the dynamics of political rule in Iraq during the last 4 years, 2010 to 2014, the second term of Nouri al-Maliki's government, in order to shed light on the political system and its internal workings. So it begins with the parliamentary elections of March 2010, and the consolidation of Maliki's rule in spite of strong local and national opposition currents up until the emergence of ISIS and the invasion of northern Iraq. So how did the Maliki government respond to political challenges that it faced during that time period, 2010 to 2014? And to what extent are Maliki's political strategies reflected in the words of Oussama Maqdisi, who argued that sectarianism is not an upswelling of primordial religious solidarities, but rather that sectarian tensions are actively produced. So the paper will also look a little bit at that. The analysis will be organized and conducted at 3 levels. So I'll talk first about the level of the national level, so the level of political elites. Then I'll look a little bit at what's going on at the local level of street mobilization. And third, I will talk about the regional and international level of powerful players. And this is because really the gridlock for Iraq lies in the dynamics at those 3 levels. So to start with the first section of the paper, the national level, national politics, or what I call Maliki's sectarian strategies and divisive rule. I would like to focus on 3 examples of basically political maneuvers on the part of Maliki to completely lock the political system and remain in power during those years. The first example is actually how he managed to use the judiciary arm of the state. So if we look at the parliamentary election of March 2010, what happened just before the election in January 2010 is quite interesting. The Justice and Accountability Commission issued a ban on 511 candidates and 14 party lists from the election. And that didn't really have any strong basis, but the way it was justified was through debathification. And of course, we know there are a lot of problems with debathification. It's a highly controversial policy, and it's very unclear as well in the legal texts. That move was completely political, and it shows very well because it was the coalitions that built cross-sectarian support who were the most affected, Iraqi actually. Now, despite the ban of political opponents, the result of the parliamentary elections was that the secular coalition, Al-Iraqiyya, emerged as the winner. And what we see later on, what the move was on the part of Nouri al-Maliki is quite interesting because after the win by Al-Iraqiyya, the second example that I want to give you is how the constitution was reinterpreted by Nouri al-Maliki. So the elections were followed by a political crisis, which actually tends to always happen in Iraq. And the roots of that, the root causes of that political crisis following the elections had to do with the ambiguities of the constitution itself, because the constitution had also been drafted quite in haste and has also many flaws. So one of the particular issues after the election was the question of whether the party that received the most votes was the winner, or rather a coalition that would be constituted after the elections. And so Maliki asked the Supreme Federal Court, and the answer that he got was actually favorable to him. And that's how he was able to build a coalition after the election and remain in power. So then we end up with the Erbil Agreement, which still contained 15 points to limit Maliki's ability to exercise personal power, so to really curb his power. But then again, later on, a year later, he rejects the agreement that he had signed to remain in power. So in December 2011, he just rejects the agreement altogether. So here we see with those examples how the usage of the judiciary on the one hand and the reinterpretation of the constitution on the other were really tools used by the political elite to remain in power. Now the third example is how he faced the federal threat. So in the fall of 2011, this new threat in the form of decentralization came about. So it's a time when key Iraqi politicians attempted to push for regional decentralization, which actually is stipulated within the frame of the constitution, so it has strong legal basis. And in October 2011, for instance, the Salahuddin Council voted to move forward with a referendum on decentralization. Diyala followed later on. And the regime's response to those threats were twofold. So first, there was use of state's coercive power. So we had a wave of arrests actually across Salahuddin, Anbar, Diyala, all of which are Sunni majority territories where Iraqiyya obtained the most votes. And then the second strategy was for Nouri al-Maliki to denounce the Federalists on two grounds. First, he declared that the projects were actually not aimed at creating federal regions, but rather they would become a shelter for terrorists, for Baathists. And of course, the rhetoric of terrorism was also something that has been commonly used. On the other hand, he also said that these projects did not have the economic ability to sustain themselves. So in the face of this gridlocked political system that showed increasing signs of authoritarianism, actually, Maliki's political opponents did not have many options on the table. There was an attempt to use a vote of no confidence from the parliament, but because the executive had become so strong, that could not even be used, because Maliki was also able to marginalize opponents, to govern through the ministries, and to basically circumvent the participation of parliament. So now we get to the second level of the analysis, looking at the street level, the popular movements. So if we look at the period between 2010 and 2014, we can notice basically two main moments, key moments, two important popular movements that took place. Number one, it's the Iraqi Spring of 2011, and number two, it's the Sunni Spring from late 2012 up to 2014. So in terms of the first one, the Iraqi Spring of 2011, what we notice in February 2011 is a start of Iraqi protests that really came in the wake of the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions. So there are a lot of actually similarities between the movement in Iraq and the other revolutions throughout the region. Hundreds of protesters gathered in several major towns, mostly Baghdad and Karbala, and the demonstrations quickly spread throughout the country. If we look at the symbols used during those protests, we can see that they were explicitly against sectarianism, which the protesters actually attributed to the elite strategies of dividing and ruling. So one of the most important symbols, for example, aside the Iraqi flags, was a red card in the shape of a map of Iraq with banners around calling for a united country. There were also signs remembering the 1920 uprising against the Brits, and we can also notice the Tahrir Square, located in central Baghdad, which carried strong symbolism because Baghdad had been divided into nearly exclusively Sunni and Shia neighborhoods during the civil war of 26 to 28, 2008. And the area of Tahrir was one of the very few areas left that remained mixed. And then secondly, the protesters organized mixed Sunni-Shia prayers in the adjacent park, recalling the ways in which Muslims and Christians in Egypt's Tahrir Square protected each other during the protests. Now, the government response to that movement was a mix of a carrot and stick approach. On the one hand, Maliki made conciliatory announcements to demobilize. So he made a few announcements. On the other hand, he also used state power to crush demonstrations. We have a good example with the Day of Rage, February 25th. Massive arrests and other things. Now, if we look at the second movement that I mentioned, the Sunni Spring, the protests started in late 2012, and they continued throughout 2013 and even 2014. And they're quite different in nature from the earlier Iraqi Spring. These protests started in the overwhelmingly Sunni northwest, and they started also because of the raid of the Minister of Finance, Rafi al-Isawi's house, and the arrest of his bodyguards. So these protests, while peaceful, were clearly directed at Sunni marginalization and the sectarian agenda of Maliki. So they demanded, for example, the departure of Maliki and a new government that was more inclusive of Sunnis, the end of anti-terrorist laws and de-Ba'athification laws used against Sunnis to alienate them. The initial demands encompassed also other broader issues of human rights, social issues, female political prisoners, for example. But the very fact that this movement was led by Sunni clerics, Sunni tribal leaders, affiliates of the Iraqi Islamic Party, Baathists, all of that prevented it from gathering cross-sectarian support. And the symbols used also during the protests are very different than the earlier Iraqi Spring. Now, the government response was actually, again twofold. First, there was actually the government ignored the protests and the claims, and then it proceeded to undertake violent crackdown. There was also, of course, a very violent attack on the protest camps in Ramadi and Al-Hawija as well in April 2013 and in December 2013. And this crackdown, if we look at it, was both unnecessary and unjustified, actually, especially at the time, because the protests at that time were actually dwindling. They were becoming actually less and less. And the country was also relatively stable. So now if we look at the reasons why this could have happened, the crackdown at that time, it does seem like the election and the election agenda might have been a reason for this. And the consequence of the crackdown also needs to be underlined, because the popular movement started to militarize and became increasingly sectarian. That was also due to, of course, government forces composed of Shiite units attacking the protesters. So following the clashes between Sunni fighters and the army in Anbar, for example, the Iraqi army withdrew and Al-Qaeda forces went into the city. Arrangements were made to channel a growing influx of weapons and jihadi fighters from neighboring Syria into Iraq, where the sectarian conflict was escalating. And then I don't need to go into that really, but we have also the development of ISIS till the situation that we observe today. So this gets me actually to my third and last part, looking at the international and regional level. And this is where I think this actually seals the deadlock for the Iraqi political system. Because as we saw at the national level, all the political maneuvers that actually have become just mainstream and normalized are something that prevents any type of opening, any types of power sharing. And we saw also the way political elites can deal with popular movements. Now, at the international level, we also observe quite problematic dynamics. The current crisis that Iraq is living is also the outcome of a regional and international game between powerful states, all having a stake in pushing for a specific outcome in the country. So if I just say a few words about the main players, the United States, Iran, or the Gulf states. The United States, to start with, I think the US has a particular responsibility in Iraq's failure as a state because, of course, of the 2003 invasion. Since the invasion and occupation of Iraq in March 2003, the US has made a number of poor political decisions concerning the country and its viability as a state. First and foremost, the US destroyed the institutions of Iraq for fear of a Ba'athist comeback. That was really the thing they were obsessed with at the time, and left behind a collapsed state. Second, the post-2003 political order was really organized along sectarian lines and led to a clear marginalization of a segment of society. While local elites certainly have a large culpability in this, the US should have pushed for more strongly actually, for adequate representation of the Sunni minority in the country. And I think the appalling continuous support that the US maintained for years to Nouri al-Maliki, despite obvious signs that he had divided Iraq and exacerbated tensions, is a factor to consider in the current crisis. Now, Iran, I think there is a sentence by Lakhdar Brahimi, who came to the Middle East Institute recently, where I work, and who just told us about Iran when talking about politics in Iraq. He just said that the US offered Iraq to Iran on a golden tray. So that was his way of summarizing it. I think it's very clear that Iran has been playing a very large role in the current Iraqi crisis. It has condemned Baghdad's sectarian policies, but also sent its own Shiite militias to both Iraq and Syria, creating strong resentment amongst the Sunni populations. The General Qasim Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force unit of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, for example, is known to have tremendous influence on Iraqi leaders, operating through proxies such as Hezbollah and other Shiite militias. The new Prime Minister, Al-Abadi, was designed after Iran's acceptance of him for the office. Now, with the growing threat represented by the Caliphate, Iran has been emphasizing the need for a more unifying government. However, it is actually very doubtful that they will push for more inclusion. Now, the Gulf states, of course, they also certainly had a role to play in the growth of IS, just as Iran contributed also to further Sunni radicalization through its support of Shiite militias throughout the region. Saudi Arabia, for instance, did fund Sunni militants against the Maliki regime, but now finds itself facing the threat of the Caliphate at its borders. But it's clear also that private Saudi and Gulf donors have been also a source of funding for the group early on. But now it's important also to know that such sources of income have become marginal today, since the Caliphate has gained access to its own oil fields in northern Iraq and northeast Syria. So for the Gulf states, the stakes are to curb actually the growth, of course, of Shiism in the region and to rein in the influence of Iran. Now, beyond those particular players, there has been a collective international failure, including the Baghdad-based UN assistance mission in Iraq, to press the Iraqi government effectively to implement urgently needed political reforms that have been sacrificed in the interest of fighting terrorism, for instance. It's very critical that, I believe, international players, particularly Iran, the most important one here, sit together to find a real political solution to the conflict. Now, of course, there needs to be political will to do that, and right now it's not there. But there needs to be concessions made to their own agendas and strategies. I think the growth of the Caliphate and the threat that it's posing should have been, the growth of IS from the beginning should have been a warning signal to the current political games played at the international level. So right now it really looks like only an international congress gathering all the players can help solve the crisis, because it really isn't just something that can be done at the national level. And there needs to be will to fix this really dysfunctional Iraqi political system, which is the root cause of the current crisis. So several issues that need to be addressed would include reforming the institutions, drafting a new constitution, establishing more independent judiciary and legal branches. And without a comprehensive plan and the involvement of all actors, it's very doubtful that Iraq or even Syria will really have a chance to live in peace in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next presentation is about necessity for Iraq state building for peace. She presented by Uzum, Assist Pro from Istanbul Aydın University. Yeah, 20 minutes.
Thank you. I think that I will move from the last question of Dr. Nassimo. And state building in Iraq in the post-Saddam era has been one of the main concerns of scholars. Even though 11 years passed after the collapse of the Saddam regime, the state building still keeps up to date. And why? Because of the continuation of the high possibility of territorial disintegration of Iraq, first, and or because of the newly emerging threats from, for instance, the emergence of ISIS. And of course, we can expand the list of why state building still keeps up to date. Let's start with remembering what happened in the post-Saddam period, even though Dr. Nesima gave a broad background about this issue. But Iraq became a failed state because of some reasons, and it has some characteristics of becoming a failure state. The first one is it lost the control of its territory and or the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within Iraq, and the emergence of paramilitary groups based on ethnic and sectarian differences was caused by the loss of control of the state over its territory. And the second feature of failed state is the erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, and the deadlocks in the ruling bodies, the legitimate deficit because of the exclusion of some groups, either sectarian or ethnic means, the uncertainties over the appointment to the sensitive ministries, specifically Minister of Internal Affairs and the Minister of Defense, and in conclusion of some issues such as the status of the Kirkuk, for instance, and the distribution of the budget of natural resources have worked against the creation or construction of harmony of states in the post-Saddam Iraq. And of course, lastly, the characteristics of a failed state is the inability to provide public services. And within this framework, the Islamic State of Iraq was established in 2006. In retrospect, it can be said that its emergence at that time is not surprising because 2005 and 2006 were the years of increasing internal othering, specifically between Sunnis and Shias in Iraq. In addition, the movement of global jihadists to Iraq in order to fight against the United States immediately after the collapse of the Saddam regime, and the transformation of popular demonstrations to the civil war in Syria complicated the issue and complicated to grasp the rising of ISIS. What I'm interested in here, how the current unstable situation in Iraq can be changed rather than to understand or grasp or explain the roots and the causes of the emergence and of the ISIS. Therefore, my research question is, how would first the negative peace and then positive peace be constructed in Iraq? Of course, I am using here negative peace and positive peace from Galtung definition. Negative peace here refers to the absence of organized collective violence. Positive peace refers here to the presence of cooperation based on the sum of the total consensual values. As I mentioned before, state building has been one of the popular topics among scholars after the Iraqi War of 2003. With a quick review of the literature, it is observed that sometimes the terms of state building and nation building have been used interchangeably. It seems that the use of the term nation building by the Bush administration during the United States invasion to Afghanistan and Iraq also led to this confusion. In addition, several scholars attempted to demonstrate how state building and national building work for the peace building process. Even though the state building and national building have sometimes been used interchangeably, for some scholars, namely Marina Ottaway, for instance, mean different processes. Ortadoğu argues that while the state building aims to develop political system to serve for integrity, the nation building strengthens the integrity of multi-ethnic states. So these processes are totally different, and they mean different, or they have different conclusions as a result. And in this article, in my article as well, state building and nation building processes are treated as different from each other. While state building refers to construct or reconstruct state institutions, the nation building means to efforts to create an identity, a national identity, which will work for the unification of a state. Of course, there are many approaches to state building, which emphasize respectively different dimensions of this process, such as the establishment of the state institutions, reconstruction of state apparatus, and specifically in the post-conflict era, and building legitimacy of state in the eyes of its citizens. Taking into account the importance of the role and the functions or the necessity of institutional apparatus of state, it seems that the socio-political factors also play a significant role in state building, as underlined by Joel Migdal. I use Joel Migdal's approach, state and society approach, specifically in this article. Therefore, it is hard to assume that state building is just a technical process or a technical issue. This view leads us to rethink about the state building and create or raise some questions. Does it solve or only refer to the establishment of ruling bodies, military or judiciary instruments, or does it beyond to the institutions? Bearing in mind these different aspects of state building process, this paper takes the consent and the participation of society to the state building process as a main determinant for a well-functioning state. In accordance with the Migdal's approach, the interaction between state and society is seen as a main determinant of a well-functioning state. Of course, I think I have to explain this approach first, and state, what does it mean state in this approach, what does it mean society? And according to Migdal, society is composed by a combination of organizations such as the clans, tribes, or families, and the state is one organization among these communities. And individuals who are or would be a member of many organizations and are primarily motivated for fulfilling their psychological and mundane needs, which is termed by Migdal as strategies for survival. And these are the blueprints for action and belief. In addition, according to this approach, each society has social control over its followers' behavior through offering some incentives or threatenings. And Migdal argues that the number of followers is dependent on the amount of the social control of the organization. And the key point here is the number of the supporters and the amount of the social control of any organization, which determine the struggle over who has the right to control or the capability to make rules in that society. And therefore the state-society interaction is treated as an influential factor for the successful state-building process. The state building process would result in either a weak state or a strong state, which are determined by the state capability to ensure order within the state, within a society, and within a weak state, the likelihood of violence, which became a political tool in the competition for gaining social control, is relatively higher than the strong states. Furthermore, the likelihood of violence is highly related with the state building process as well. Therefore, the success of state building determines the ensuring of peace and stability within a state. The state building process has always been a problematic issue in the Middle East, including in Iraq, and most of the regional states have legitimate deficit because of the imperialist policies, which drew artificial boundaries, which installed elites from outside and made them to be dependent on the external resources. And as a result of the legitimate deficit, the politics has never been civilized or internalized in the Middle East, including Iraq. And therefore, state in society approach would also create an opportunity to solve legitimate deficit. In conclusion, it seems that a successful state building process is the sole solution to build negative peace in Iraq first. And for the positive peace, we should go further, and society reformation and the balanced state-society relations by which every part of the society can find a room to involve in politics are needed. And of course, nobody can say that it's an easy task. But what is certain that for a successful state building, local initiatives rather than the external interventions are required. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next paper presenting by Anna Abbott, PhD candidate from King's College of London. It's about an independent Kurdistan national challenge and regional realities. Please, you have 20 minutes.
Okay. Well, hi everybody. Just so you get an idea, the independence of Kurdistan has been broadly discussed. It's been going on for years, but especially given the current context of the last summer and the negotiation of government formation in Baghdad and past the elections, the independence of Kurdistan has been discussed by so many parties inside and outside of Iraq. I will give you an overall picture from inside Kurdistan and outside factors that are affecting its independence. So by no means is it an exhaustive account as to why Kurdistan's independence is happening or not happening. So again, just maybe you can follow with question and answer session after. Nationalism and territorial control in Iraqi Kurdistan are a prominent aspect of the discourse for independence. Many consider that the semi-autonomous area is a referendum away from becoming an independent and well-functioning country. Yet, if Iraqi Kurdistan has been acting as a de facto state, especially more so since 2005, the KRG, or the Kurdistan Regional Government, has striven to demonstrate in its bid for legitimacy that it can indeed function like a state by ensuring border control, economic viability, political stability, and internal security, all factors which have been recently challenged. In contrast to the rest of Iraq, it is true that Kurdistan looks like a success story. It is the other Iraq. By de facto state, I just want to explain very quickly. I mean that a de facto state exists where there is an organized political leadership which has risen to power through some degree of organized political leadership, of indigenous capability, receives popular support, but is unable to achieve any degree of substantive recognition and therefore remains illegitimate in the eyes of the international community. It is that quest for legitimacy that makes institutional and political performances pivotal for recognition, and in the case of Kurdistan, will likely pave the way for independence. I'm going to talk a little bit about Kurdistan's bid for legitimacy and its political and economic viability, and how this has been the building block of a long-dream nation state, which unfortunately, in my opinion, and I welcome any challenge to this, I believe are still lacking to this day. For example, despite greater aspiration for independence, divisions among the political parties and their leading figures, combined with unequal wealth repartition and redistribution, along with regional interference from neighboring powers, are considerably undermining the push for the sovereignty and legitimacy of the state. Kurdish leadership has failed so far to form a united front in dealing with central aspects of state-building endeavor. And, for example, this was patent in the implementation and the discussion around the implementation of Article 140, the power-sharing agreement with Baghdad and inside Kurdistan, or unified commercial or foreign policies. So in this paper I will discuss. So now I'll start with what I consider local or national challenges proper to KRG only. At a political level, Kurdistan's domestic structure is that of a relatively centralized government dominated by the two main parties' Politburo, that of the Kurdish Democratic Party and the PUK, the Kurdistan Patriotic Union Kurdistan Party. Kurdistan's political factionalism shatters the illusion of a stable and politically united Kurdistan heading towards independence. This is manifest on a number of levels, ranging from security to foreign policy formulation, as mentioned earlier on. The tensions between Barzani's KDP and Talabani's PUK reached their nadir in the mid-90s, which erupted in a civil war and that tore the region apart, and which was mainly over control of resources. A power-sharing agreement was brokered between them at the behest of the United States, but mutual mistrust of one another between the parties and their security forces remained to this day. Both parties have ruled the KRG in relative stability, although they both have in fact divided the region into two zones, under the respective control of their security and police forces. Both parties dispose of their own Peshmerga, which, if we take a closer look at, are organized more like party militias rather than professional military units. According to an interview with Mustafa Kadir for the publication The Iraq Oil Report, only around 50,000 Peshmerga are organized under Kadir's ministry, or the Peshmerga's ministry, and the KDP and the PUK political parties each retained about 60,000 fighters under political chain of command, and each also has their own paramilitary forces. They train differently, they have different uniforms, and they operate differently. And in terms of communication between both, it's very restricted. Generals from the parties have squabbled publicly, and the failures to resupply each other during key battles with ISIS have also been evident. In addition, each Peshmerga forces have been fighting different battles for different interests. Case in point, the recent fighting that took place over the summer have shown that these rivalries become an impediment to internal stability and border protection at the most crucial time. For example, the KDP Peshmerga lost Mahmoud this summer. This loss was attributed to a failure of the KDP to demonstrate effective leadership in KRG. And this was a rhetoric that was really gaining momentum among PUK members, that was pushed forward. And in PUK dominated territories, this is something that has been hugely promulgated. Likewise, when the Yazidi asked for weaponry and reinforcement from the KDP Peshmerga in light of a possible ISIS onslaught, the KDP allegedly, and I say allegedly because, again, it's based a lot on rumors and you never know for 100% inside of Iraq, allegedly refused, thus generating considerable resentment among the Kurds and the Yazidis. The reason may range from poor leadership to lack of capacity, but the most commonly circulated reason is that the KDP actually planned to exploit the crisis to gain more weapons and international support in its bid for seceding from Iraq. Regardless what one is to think, But the attacks took place in Sinjar, which was among the disputed territories that KRG had claims on. And now only one can wonder what legitimacy over that territorial area would look like. On the other hand, PUK Peshmerga, the one who took control of Kirkuk, a key city in the narrative of an independent Kurdistan, but also a PUK-controlled city, it's a completely different situation. In an interview, for example, with a former KDP member of parliament who spoke under condition of anonymity, despite the blame cast on KDP by PUK members, many are quick to forget also that Hawija was lost by PUK Peshmerga, and it still endures heavy fighting. At least we regain control of our territories. PUK's seeming ability to have maintained control over the city of Kirkuk compared to military and territorial losses, initial losses by the KDP, was interpreted by the PUK as a propitious moment to expose the political flaws of its arch-rival, not as a moment to strategically rethink the consequences of what it may have on national unity and the future of the state of Kurdistan. In light of this, it just shows you how deep the fracture is. And this is at a time when, personally at least, I consider that as Kurdistan, whether it's KDP or Peshmerga, are fighting ISIS on different fronts over the recently gained territory, it's an existential fight for Kurdistan. Yet inside Kurdistan, you see no political hegemony, no real agreement as to how to develop even a coordinated military strategy on how to deal with ISIS. Likewise, I mean, another rumor that I've heard is that most of the weapons that are being brought to Erbil, which is under KDP control, are not being redistributed to PUK, and in exchange, PUK is turning to Iran for military protection and for weapons as well. In light of the recent increase of territories by 40%, soon after ISIS stories in Iraq, Kurdish President Masoud Barzani committed to a referendum for independence before the Kurdish parliament, asking MPs to set a date. However, the claim for an imminent independence or referendum have also long been a tool by the different parties, and especially in the case of KDP recently, when the party's popularity or prominent role may have been in jeopardy. The rhetoric of national independence has mainly acted as a detractor to growing protest and resentment against the party inside KRG. At the time, PUK Peshmerga had, as mentioned above, just taken control over Kirkuk, which combined with last April's provincial elections victory of the party in the city, which made PUK more central to determining the future of Kurdistan, not only because of political control, but also because of its grip over oil resources in the oil-rich area of Kirkuk. Likewise, Iraqi politicians at the time dismissed Barzani's statement as an attempt to gain leverage in the national government formation process, where Kurdish MPs are a minority. Finally, Barzani's address may also have been perceived as little more than an attempt to garner international legitimacy for independence, a call that went unheeded overall. According to members of PUK Political Bureau and Chief PUK Public Relations Office, Saidi Pirey, the referendum pushed forward by President Barzani is no more than a rhetoric, but not in fact an immediate concern. A referendum, in his view, should be to know what the Kurds want. Indeed, when I spoke to different members of PUK and about the issue of a referendum and how to formulate the referendum, what are the expectations of the referendum, I think unequivocally, publicly at least, KDP are quite straightforward that it's for independence, self-determination, the sovereignty of the states, whereas PUK actually formulates the objective of the referendum in completely different terms. It's more through legal and political frameworks for that, and a referendum is more to determine actually what questions are we going to ask the Kurds. There are so many issues that are being brought to the table that even in terms of negotiating with Baghdad, when Kurdish political parties engage with Baghdad in terms of negotiations, it's never a straightforward issue. You have the hydrocarbon law, you have the issue of oil resources sharing, you have the issue of Kirkuk or Article 140 for other disputed territories. So independence comes as one of this long list of demands, and since the Kurdish parties don't actually agree on it and come with that set of demands straight to Baghdad, a number of political figures inside Kurdistan who did not want their name mentioned on this issue said that as long as they don't have their house in order, they cannot actually go forward with an independence or even maintaining a strong position vis-à-vis Baghdad, which is affecting the negotiating position or bargaining position inside of Iraq. Back to the issue of independence, I mean, similarly, not all the Kurds rallied behind Barzani's call for independence, mainly because they have conceptions that differ and expectations as to what an independent Kurdistan would look like that do not necessarily match that of KDP or Barzani's. One of PUK's co-founder of the party's central committee, Adil Murad, differed with Barzani's regarding possible independence, whereby if it were to occur, as I mentioned, it would be through a legal framework. This was also echoed by Nejdim Karim, Kirkuk's governor and a leading PUK figure. And while the Kurdish parties had agreed to form a committee to discuss the issue with other Iraqi parties at the time, PUK leaders met with former Prime Minister Maliki and Ibrahim al-Jafari outside the framework agreed by the Kurds, which showed a different political stance altogether. More recently, Iraqi President and PUK member Fouad Massoum announced that independence is also very far from happening, at least from happening soon, despite claims by the rival party. The fact that it was declared also at the Atlantic Council in New York during an official visit is also a clear message that they're more likely to be aligned with US foreign policy vision, the PUK at least. Furthermore, it does show that in this alignment between the US and the party, the government of Iraq, PUK sees Kurdistan's immediate future within the framework of the constitution of Iraq, while KDP is more likely to lean toward the separatist trend. KDP poses inside of Kurdistan as the uncontested ruling party, while PUK is still struggling also to reassert its position in light of leadership's internal conflict and several electoral losses to Goran, as was noted on the parliamentary elections and the provincial elections. The Goran movement, led by Nashirwan Mustafa, takes the position that the Kurds have a right to independence, but that the institution of an independent state should be constructed prior to the state's declaration. On a TV network, Mustafa believes that declared on July 6 that he believed that an independent Kurdistan should not just be based on rhetoric, but also on democratic, accountable and transparent rule. And Goran is likely to oppose KDP's stance after agreeing to form a KRG cabinet with Barzani's parties last April. Same for the Islamic Union of Kurdistan and the Islamic Group of Kurdistan, which hold together about 16 seats in KRG's parliament. They do support as well in Iraqi Kurdistan, but not at the expense of democracy or reforms, or at least so they claim. For example, both pointed out that the claims for independence and building of institutions should be reflected in local politics, denouncing the hold of the monopoly that the two main parties have over the political process. The Kurdish political parties had agreed on a broad-based government, and all of them are part of the current KRG. But however, there are concerns that KDP's exclusion of the PUK and others in areas where it's strongest, such as Erbil or the Hook, may result in a reversal of the situation in Kirkuk, where KDP would find itself mainly excluded. Kirkuk is in and of itself a topic that is delicate and a topic of its own, not just between Erbil and Baghdad, but also a sore point between PUK and KDP. Currently, PUK's stronghold is Kirkuk, which, as mentioned above, is key for Kurdistan's independence. The party holds, PUK holds 8 of the 12 seats in the Iraqi parliament. When Kirkuk came under the control of PUK, Barzani pushed for public appearances in Kirkuk. However, if you look at the pictures from the former interviews and on TV at the time, in late June and early July, it was always without any representative from the PUK or with Nejdim Karim absent from the picture, i.e. making a statement that Kirkuk is part of a Kurdistan under KDP's vision. At least I interpreted it as such. Likewise, while declaring that Article 140 has also been obsolete, many PUK officials and Kirkuk's governors have declared the opposite, that the future of Kirkuk and disputed territories would have to go through the consent of Baghdad. However, I just want to come back on this. It is true to some extent that PUK is more likely to cooperate with Baghdad on the issues of the disputed territories. However, I think inside PUK you will find different stances and different positions. That are also the reason of the party's weakened position inside of Kurdistan, despite all the accusation that turns against PUK or KDP or whatever party. PUK is currently facing a real leadership crisis, with Talabani fading away from the public scene. And this was quite apparent in the nomination or the appointment of the president. There was a real competition inside of PUK between Bahram Saleh and Muslim Karim, and at the end of the day it ended up being Fouad Massoum, because this was a figure that both politicians could agree on. That was one of the key factors in the appointment of that president. And that weakening of PUK's leadership is definitely affecting its position inside Kurdistan. And essentially, Kirkuk is key to their political survival and to developing their strategy over the coming years. And if Kurdistan was to become independent, even in 5 years from now, Kirkuk under PUK redefines PUK's role politically as central. So these diverging stances on independence expose the political and rhetoric gaps dividing Kurdistan. Another issue, as I mentioned, are the issues of national resources. HDR Army, for example, the Natural Resources Minister declared that the Kurds plan to multiply by 8 their exports by 2015. This is including oil field from Kirkuk. The right to sell oil is at the core of the dispute between Baghdad and Erbil, and Kirkuk is central to that dispute. But it's also central to building, this leads me to my next issue, the issue of an economic viability for Kurdistan. Kurdistan's economic achievements are undeniably impressive. If you look at Kurdistan 10 years ago and you look at it today, it's quite incredible what has been achieved. However, there are huge limitations. The region has known since 2012 an average of an 8% growth rate and plans to build free trade zones with Turkey and Iran by 2016. The oil industry remains central to the region's burgeoning economy, and despite its attractive investment laws, corruption and unequal wealth distribution remain a key problem in the governance of the region. The penetration of neo-patrimonialism within supposedly the current modern governance system brings with it chronic corruption and captures the public sector by the leading parties. In many cases, the provision of public goods based on social needs and development priorities, i.e. the nominal goals of the formal state structure, is a mere facade for bargaining in the political marketplace, where state provision is brought and offered in order to secure allegiance and favors, and public sentiment is mobilized by populist, ethnic, or exclusionary appeals. The two dominant parties have been forced into analytic collaboration to garner that long-sought legitimacy to be recognized as a state by the international community. So Kurdistan's own boon actually mainly stems from its stability, but it's also a share of Iraq's national budget rather than its own regional development. More importantly, given that the oil trade remains largely secretive because of Erbil's and Baghdad's relation and a lack of proper institution to regulate the oil industry in KRG, many feel that any oil tapped will further send Kurdistan on the path to become a kleptocracy. The New Yorker recently published an article actually discussing the independence of Kurdistan and its reliance on the oil sector. As one representative of a communication company explained, regarding wealth management and oil distribution in the future of Kurdistan could go two ways. It could either become the example of Norway, or it could become the example of Nigeria. With an independent Kurdistan with a legitimate oil and gas industry accepted by Baghdad and internationally fare better, the outcome may be in fact between Norway and Nigeria, but more likely like a Gulf state, where a wealthy and unaccountable minority rules the nation. Indeed, even from an economic model standpoint, Kurdistan is very much adopting a rentier state model economy rather than diversifying its economic portfolio, and therefore raises many questions as to its sustainability. People do protest against the regional governments overall, and okay, sorry. Okay, so people do protest the corruption and the unequal repartition of wealth. However, there is overall a widespread anger at the two-party domination and corruption in the KRG area. The former state structure may conceal beneath it a parallel or a shadow set of institutions that hold real power. And as a consequence of this hollowing out of formal public spaces and the widening gap between the discourse of a legitimate and capable state and the reality of everyday political management, public disaffection and division become increasingly visible. There are patent frustration associated with the increasing visible contradiction between the economic growth and poverty and on one hand and the wealth and social inequalities on the other hand. Okay, so I'll skip very quickly on to the conclusion and I'll stop. I mean, just a keynote actually, because I was going to talk a little bit more about Iran and Turkey and the role that they do play also. It's a schematization and it's an oversimplification to say that on one hand you have KDP's relationship with Turkey and on the other hand PUK's relationship with Iran, and these two huge regional power are playing a massive role on these two parties' internal dynamic and the stability of Kurdistan. But I think what is important to take away from their relationship is that KDP has really valorized, especially Barzani, Masoud Barzani has valorized that relationship between KDP and Turkey. I mean, most of the investments that are being done right now are by Turkey inside of Kurdistan, and they're mainly focused around the Erbil area. Likewise, in terms of military help or diplomatic relationship, Iran plays a key role in the relationship with between PUK and Baghdad. And this was quite notable on the battlefront. I mean, I was on the road to Kirkuk actually last week, and you could find Iranian-backed militias and heading to the front south of Kirkuk, which you won't see really around the Erbil area. Overall, so factionalism has been plaguing Kurdish institutions, dividing them among the parties, and remaining a key obstacle to proper institution building and impeding sound economic development. Kurdistan has actually all the factors for independence. I'm not saying that it's on its way to becoming a failed state, or it's a failure, or it's a mirage in a sea of states that are facing their own trouble. Quite the opposite. But I think Kurdish independence is possible and is viable, but not tomorrow. And there is a huge need for institution building, sound governance, and stepping away from that monopoly that the two parties have on political power, and the other small political parties such as Goran or Islamic Unions are jockeying in between those parties alone. That's it.
Thank you very much. Many information, many arguments. Now we open or give you opportunity to ask. Yes.
So I have a few comments on the speech. As an Iraqi, Kurdistan as a Kurdistan within Iran and from the Kurdistan I have a few comments on your speech. First of all, you mentioned the Kurdish dependency. The Kurdish dependency is not based on internal issues. Also, we should go out to the outside of the world. And for example, especially when we talk about the Kurdish dependency, we should focus on the situation of Syria, the politics of Syria, Iran, and Turkey, because there's also Kurdish case in this country. This is first. And second, about Kashmir, you mentioned mentioned as militia or was it divided group in two common sort of countries, and that UK and America. But we should remember that, we all should remember that we have the Minister of Regional Affairs, which is the member of ORMER. So this is a huge change, and these positive changes are pushing the Kurdistan region nationally ahead. And it is a militia. Even if we assume that this is a militia, this militia is based on the military who are not able to stand against Daesh, against ISIL, and so on. It was pushed ahead, pushed back into that of one day and night. Yeah, you mentioned some internal leadership crisis, but we also should remember that we are not living in the middle of 90s, we are living in the 2 or 40. So there were some crises, and there are still some crises, but there are huge developments in terms of economy, in terms of leadership. We should remember that even if we have, I mean, the Kurdish political parties have some internal issues, but they are united in Baghdad. We should remember that there was a coalition, namely the Kurdistan group, the Kurdistan coalition in the Department of Iraq. So in these cases, the Kurdish are united. But if we go to the question, the Kurdish independency, it's not based on only these issues, internal issues, but it is also based on the external issues. Thank you.
You can, yes.
No, I agree with everything you said. And there are also external factors that didn't get a chance to come to. But it's okay.
Thanks.
No, just the point I wanted to make. Yes, I mean, one thing I've noticed is that it's true. You have, again, I pointed out to some of the issues that Kurdistan is facing. Not to say that Kurdistan's independence will fail as a result of this feature. Actually, to be honest, it's quite a positive step that you have political disagreement, and these are being more or less resolved or discussed through political channels rather than shooting each other in the street or degenerating into a war. I mean, yes, this is part, I think, of, if you look at it, of the democratic process that is taking place inside of Kurdish politics compared to what you would see. Now, I'm just saying that this is not about Kurdish independence happening or not happening. Again, my conclusion is yes, and frankly, if Kurdistan can make it, I'm all for it. Yes, but it's not for tomorrow. And I'm challenging really many KDP's rhetoric, and especially Barzani's rhetoric of an aggressive independence at all costs tomorrow to prove that we can do it today. I mean, frankly, if you look at the state of Kurdistan's economy, you're relying on the budget from Baghdad. Okay, so without this, the salary crisis or the oil shortages that affected Kurdistan in June and July also were a massive issue. Your KRG is also overwhelmed with a huge population of refugees. There is an issue of state institution. Corruption is rampant. There is barely any wealth redistribution. I know now also that one of the arguments that is put forward is that if Kurdistan was to be a state tomorrow, they could have their own oil industry and they could be transparent about it, and they would be adhering to more international standards of transparency and accountability. Now, I don't actually believe in this. I think accountability, transparency, no country is perfect, but there is still rampant corruption inside Kurdistan and very little redistribution. I mean, your average Kurd inside of Erbil is making, what, $400 a month?
Yeah, if we compare that situation that we talked about, even now, if we compare right now with 5 years ago, it's a very different. There are also...
And I did say this. I said that if you look at Kurdistan, it's been on a rising curve.
Just compare Baghdad with Erbil.
We can give another chance for another questions. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Kemal Bartigar. I'm from Iran. And I was wondering, how has the issue of ISIL, or the Islamic State, affected the Kurdistan independency recently? Perhaps Dr. Mahmoud can also make comment on that. But in terms of the Kurdish domestic politics, how has this issue affected that? Has it triggered a new debate? Has it stopped the right time or going faster, whatever? So,
I think you probably can answer this even better than me, but yeah, I think on the one hand, the fact that it enabled the KRG to actually extend its territories, which means also it's newly acquired wealth, like in the case of Kirkuk, that it's the fact the situation that has changed on the ground is making Kurdish political leadership redefine Kurdistan and the role that the political parties are going to play inside of that greater Kurdistan now. And I'm talking about those extended territories, not Kurds in Syria or Turkey and so forth. I think also it's brought Kurdish leadership to reconsider some of its economic policy with Kirkuk for sure, and the oil policy, but also the new alliance, the fact that the West actually turned to Kurdistan and came to the help of Erbil. I just remember when that was. It was in early August, right? When they came, they were at the last 3rd of August, 4th of August. Anyway, the fact that Kurdistan became a partner of choice, a partner that the United States or European Union countries could rely on, and that they accepted to give them weapons, albeit old weapons and ammunitions, allowed the Kurdish leadership to redefine its role, I think, in the region as well, showing, and they interpreted this as a backing or a support by the international community for their project of independence. Now, this also is playing in on internal dynamic as to are we going to have a Kurdistan that is defined according to KDP's ideology, where it's a leading party and it's the one taking Kurdistan to the statute of a state, or is it going to be a PUK, or is there going to be a greater power sharing agreement? And this is still playing out, and even right now, in terms of redefining a military strategy, they're quite working on it. They're reassessing their need for weapons, and they're looking now for potential sellers who will sell them sophisticated weapons, not just against ISIS, but for them to develop a proper army that they can face off or stave off external attacks or issues, especially on the territories. And it's also played a big role on the issue of Article 140, which is something Baghdad has been dilly-dallying around and doesn't want to discuss. I mean, to most of the political leadership I spoke to inside of Kurdistan, they're saying basically it's changed on the ground. We'll just go through the legal process. But this is one PUK member who told me this, who is on the committee inside the KRG's parliament. She told me simply, Article 140 for us is a formality. We do it, we've shown we've done our due diligence and due process, but now it's ours. End of the story.
I think the Iraqi government did support one of the big problems with the Baghdad did accept to support Peshmerga before or after 2003, and it's a big problem facing KRG to how defense and also the ICs now, I think they have weapons more developed if we compare with the Kurdistan with the Peshmerga. So I think when the Daesh coming to Kurdistan, Kurds have two things. One is positive that the coalition, international coalition, they support Peshmerga and send their weapons. On the other hand, I think is loses something. For example, when the president of Kurdistan region, Masoud Barzani, after Mosul, they go to dispute areas and said, okay, we don't need Article 140. We now beginning to referendum in this dispute area, but this all make some threat for some countries in this region, like Iran, maybe like Turkey. Therefore, in the end, we didn't see anything change in this process. Yes.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Nassima and Dr. Hassan. In terms of both of your analysis of the Iraqi situation, you very carefully laid out the problems of state building, and you're very careful to say how many people were involved in making things difficult for different actors and things like that. What I was wondering is this: do you have any idea of what you think, what could have been done that would have made the situation we're in not happen or different? What do you think the project of state building from the very beginning was already going to doomed to failure in this? I know in your account you gave wrong and poor decisions being made, but to what extent those decisions were already in the context of a larger problem? And the reason I mentioned this, you mentioned, for example, the Constitution was already problematic and you said it was rushed. Well, the fact that the Constitution being rushed could also be a function of the situation in a way. What was needed? Was there a desire to construct a strong, unified, multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic state out of Iraq, or was this not really something that was there? I just wanted you to comment on that. What kind of vision did they have of the Iraqi state that would emerge after the invasion?
Thank you for your question. I don't think that there was a vision to build a state that would be inclusive of everyone in a way that would allow for peaceful living together. I think that after the invasion, and it's clearly demonstrated from a series of decisions that you might say were poor or were meant to be made in that way. But I think for example, to completely destroy a number of institutions without having an idea of how to rebuild them, or to get rid of an army when you are actually in a situation where there is much insecurity, and that the army was something that you could use and just it was absolutely necessary to keep the army as it was. You could have made changes, but not completely dismantle it. So that led to the rise of militia groups. Of course, the constitution is another important problem, but I think the way the system was thought was very divisive, and it was thought along sectarian lines. So having a system that was already thought in such a way, I mean, I think if you went to any country, in the US, for instance, and you said, well, now the president will be a Catholic, and the secretary will be Protestant, and so that leads to further divisions, and it doesn't help you build something. Then the other important factor is that a lot of the people who were brought, I think, by the coalition and who were trusted were people who had been living abroad, who were important key political figures, but who most of them had families that had suffered from the circumstances during the Saddam era. So I think that from the start you had the seeds of sort of like almost a revenge cycle starting from the start, and I think that it just went on and on, and there was never, as I see it, the ability to even stop it, to say, well, no, here, this is actually, only getting worse. So the way I see it is that the US did never really try to push Maliki to actually make certain concessions, and definitely Iran did not either. And as I see it, it's not going anywhere.
I just want to add something. Yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Nassim about the allocation of governmental posts to different sectarian or ethnic groups is a problematic, and I think that we didn't learn lessons from Lebanon because we used the same model and it didn't work. And there are some problems, and it's really a problematic model to just divide the governmental posts to among the sectarian and ethnic groups, and it doesn't work. And I think we should, international community should create a platform. It was tried during the 2006, I think, in order to include Sunnis to the political process. But it was also problematic. But what Turkey did at that time, they led this initiative and tried to include Sunni groups to the political procedure. But it was also problematic from the external intervention because it was questioned about the Turkish ambitions throughout the region then. And it was also discussed about the access shift of Turkish foreign policy, for instance. Because of that, the international community, I think, should create a platform, for instance, in order to gather the internal or local political elites. And I don't know, I think that there is no model to that process. So we have to find for Iraqi case specifically.
Just on that note, actually, whenever you have a power sharing system that is put in place, especially on ethno-sectarian quota basis, you generally need a guarantor for the functioning of that power sharing system, and the United States never really fully committed to it. And actually, they left a huge political vacuum, which later translated into a military vacuum that Iran was quite able to fill adequately. And it had its own relationship with many of the political intelligentsia that you had inside of Iraq. So, and also they had a different approach. I think you look at the Iraqis' political leadership. For them, to the United States, Iran is a political and military rival, but to Iraqi leadership, or to Kurdish leadership, it's a geographical reality and a political reality. It's a neighbor, so they have a different approach to it.
Hello, my name is Yusuf. I'm from Turkey, and my question will be for Mrs. Anna that was talking about the Kurdistan situation, and you are a kind of supporter for the independization of Kurdistan, right?
I'm sorry?
You are supporting the independization of the Kurdistan, right? Well, I will actually this topic is not I don't like it so much, but I live. I have another interest, but I have been living in the east side of Turkey for 9 years. I have been in Sakarya and Tunceli, a total for 9 years. Have you ever lived in the Kurdistan area, the Kurdish people before, or did you just read or just watch the news?
No, I live in Erbil.
Where have you been? Where have you been living?
I live in Erbil in Kurdistan.
Okay. Okay then.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to. Okay.
No, please.
Okay then. I was there. I met with a lot of Kurdish people, and I had very good friends. But the people that were living there, I have been in a building when I was like 6 years old. I have like hearing the guns around, like a lot of bombs around, and it was like you are supporting the Kurdistan independization, but it's meaningless. The Kurdish people are living in Turkey like me, and they don't have any difference with them, and they want the independization. They don't go Iraq because there's violence there. They don't go Syria, there's violence there. The Syrian people comes here, there's no violence here. This is Turkish Republic, and they want more place from Turkish Republic. And when we give more place, they will set a public and say the government land, they will come us maybe another things, another desires. You understand?
Okay.
So
Okay.
what do you think about this?
I mean, I don't understand. So, actually, I mean, what you're telling me that?
You can ask.
After this.
Now your question, please.
I asked some questions. I made some comments, and I'm waiting that she make some comments about this.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question. Actually, just reformulate it simply in simple words for me.
No, I don't something from. I just why would you support the Kurdistan? Like
Why would I?
Why would you do that? Why would you support?
Why not? I'm sorry.
No, in Germany, there are a lot of Turkish people there. And maybe if the Turkish people gathers in a city, maybe 100,000 Turkish people gathers there, and they want independence. The German government would give them independence, do you think? And why do you have Gibraltar in Spain?
But I'm not British or Spanish, but okay. Just to give it to you very quickly, an answer. Why would I support Kurdistan? I mean, I'm not actively supporting it. You won't see me demonstrating in the street for Kurdish independence, but I support it. I mean, listen, they have a right to self-determination. They do not identify with Baghdad or Arab identity. They do not identify with Iraqi identity, overarching Iraqi identity. They have a different history, a different educational system. They have their own language. And inside of Iraq, I mean, yes, if they can do it, yes.
They are living in this country, in Turkey, their culture very good.
But in Turkey, it's a different case.
Yeah.
And so it is in Iran or in Syria. I mean, I'm talking about the case of Iraq.
In the Kurdistan map, though, so there is no need to include Turkey then. So you
But that is not my decision. No.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
First of all, welcome. I have two questions. First, Dr. Nasima. For now, it looks like that Iraq, unfortunately, lost its Sunni majority people. In practice, to ISIS hegemony, and I think for the in the emotional side also. For a solution, again, a political solution which will maybe end the chaos in Iraq and the terrorism of ISIS, for example. What do you predict? What developments do you predict? Like rebuild a new Sahwa army or autonomy like a Kurdish one? This is my first question. And the second question, Sumis and Hakut. There are many recruitments to ISIS and other Islamist groups like Nusra and Ansar Islam from Kurdish region, Süleymaniye, mainly Halep. This topic, this recruitment flow, do the mainstream Kurdish political parties see them as a threat to Kurdistan and internal problem?
Can you please repeat your questions for
Again, I am wondering that for a political solution against to end the chaos in Iraq, Iraq government or the state, I think should win the Sunnis back their hearts and their land. What are your predictions about future developments? Maybe rebuild a new Sahwa army from the Sunni tribes, maybe again fight against ISIS like the old one, or build an autonomous Sunni region like the Kurdish one.
Thank you for your question. I don't think we can go back to the Sahwa movement. The context is entirely different. So this is not an option. I think that you really need to work long term. Of course, now we have ISIS, and it's a threat that you need to deal with right now. But I think that beyond, let's say, the military actions that are required, you really need to have some type of long-term plan, and you need to really start working on the political level. And what you would need to work on is rebuild some bridges with people that are basically not really part of the state the way others are. So that requires long-term policies. I think a few little steps could be looking at the claims actually that were made, for example, during what we call the Sunni Spring. I mean, they were just very, very normal demands that were made. For example, looking at the case of Sunni prisoners, and especially women who have not had any trial, So I think there are a certain number of issues that we could start looking at. There are also a lot of just basic social demands in a lot of the Sunni provinces. I mean, just having electricity working, I think, would be already like a huge step forward. I mean, a lot of the people who perhaps were tempted to join ISIS, or who had a sort of positive reaction to them when they came in, are people who basically had lost entire faith in the country they were living in, who were felt not represented at all. So I think this is where you have to start fixing things. I think it will take time, and I think also that there's an entire class of politicians and an entire system that needs to be really changed. So there is, I really don't see any quick fix. I think actually that's what the US was trying to do a lot of times, trying to find quick fixes to the situation without really answering the causes and the long-term problems. So yeah, I think it will take time and will.
Just to add also on this, there's also, like, for the Sunni community, very little political representation that the community can identify with. I mean, most of the Sunnis will call their own political leaders as what is it? Green zone Sunnis, i.e. some of them have not even been in Bardia or these areas, so they don't trust them. Now to come back on the issue of Al-Aqsa and Kurdish jihadis, I mean, this is something that's been going on for quite a while, because Al-Aqsa has had has been a source of extremist Islamist jihadis for quite a while, and before the crisis with ISIS, many of them actually went to fight in Syria. And this is something the political elite or leadership inside of Kurdistan, especially PK, has been aware of. And I don't think they see it as a threat. And they tend to undermine it publicly. They will tell you, oh, it's something like that, between 80 and 100 of them, not much more. You go on Twitter, you'll find hundreds of them. Hundreds of them. Okay, there's a lot of them. However, they're probably a tiny minority in the sea of ISIS members that you have. So as to a threat to this inner stability of Kurdistan, it seems to me they have Kurdish security has quite a good handle. As IH, and they have their counter-terrorism task force, has quite a good handle on the situation. I mean, if you look at it, there's been one car bomb that exploded outside of Erbil in September. And even then, I mean, it was claimed by ISIS, but there was really no damage. And if they had wanted to inflict significant attacks, they would have by now. I believe, at least. And it hasn't been the case. I think they're working quite efficiently. They monitor, they know who they are. They monitor where they are, where they go, their movements. They work also with members of the religious community. And if I'm not mistaken, the religious leaders in the mosque is appointed by the government, right? So yeah, so there is quite a well-coordinated effort where they control. Then after, in terms of how democratic this is another story. So a threat, no. An embarrassment, or a bit of a tricky situation of what to do or how to tame it or keep it not so public, yes.
We know the fact that Iran didn't make Maliki as its red line, as it did for Bashar al-Assad. That has a lesson, and that is that Iran favors Iraq's unity. Here there are two views about Masoud Barzani's declaring independence. One was taking revenge from Maliki, because he and his party thought that Maliki is going its own way, monopolizing power, just bypassing the Kurds. And second is that he took the opportunity to go for independence. Here I doubt that Mr. Masoud Barzani didn't know that Iran will not let this happen. The Kurdistan independence. So what's your view about these two trends? Which one is really true? The First, taking advantage of the opportunity or taking revenge of Maliki? This is one question. And how this affected the Iraqi government's relations with Masoud Barzani or the KRG right now? And what is Iran's role in this context?
This would be a general question. All of you know about Iraq.
Okay, I'll just give a brief answer. I think it's for the first question, it's a mix of both. Barzani took advantage of the situation where he felt that it was confident after all. I mean, it was the Peshmerga that controlled the territories that was defending Kurdish territories. And further on during the summer, you can see the evolution where they thought, well, you know, we are able to defend and protect our people. It's not the case of Iraq. We're literally the only army standing inside of Iraq, actually. Look at the Iraqi army, it's non-existent. So it was an opportunity for them, for him to declare this. And there is also the issue of a stance against Maliki and I think to a large extent against Baghdad. But that also ties into him satisfying the rhetorical demand of his own constituency as well. And I think, yeah, definitely, he knew that Iran wouldn't let it happen. But what I'm wondering is how much did he play his cards also with other countries, such as Turkey or such as the United States, where he's relied on that backing, actually, to ensure his position. Now, the second issue is how Iran reacted to this. I mean, it was manifold, but I just know that it's also brought a clear political rapprochement between PUK and Iran, and it triangulates with that relationship with Baghdad. And it definitely plays out in the way the channels of communication that have been established. You see a much smoother relationship, anyway, between Baghdad, PUK, and you see Iran behind favoring that. However, I mean, inside KDP, you have a generational issue. And Masoud Barzani has one specific stance, and you know, his nephew Nerchivan is on a completely different position. From what I understand, Nerchivan Barzani has a very good relationship actually with Qasem Soleimani. And then when he comes to Erbil, he talks to him directly. He doesn't talk to really anybody else inside KDP.
I don't think so. Mr. Barzani wants to make a relation between the problem of Baghdad and the independence. This is two different things. Another thing I think about Iran and Iran support, I think in the press conference with the chairman or maybe with the one of the yes, when they ask who support, the first is he told Iran and United States. So I think what I see in KRG, we face two things. The first, the problem with Baghdad is one thing. The other thing is independence. If all the problem solved with the Baghdad, that don't means we leave referendum about independence. Yeah. Last, I think, last questions.
I want to direct my question to Dr. Nassima. You have talked about that there needs to be a political will in Iran to solve this ISIS crisis. And I'm wondering, could you be more specific about this political will? How this political will be? And what are the reasons for this lack of political will?
Thank you for your question. It's a great question. It's a tough one. I think there is political will that is needed from several parties. Iran is one of them, and it's, I believe, the most important one. And of course, it has to also come from within Iraq itself and other important players such as the United States. I mean, to me, the main problem is for Iran the matter is to have a state that they can work with. So of course the idea is to have a leadership that would be close enough, and at the moment it's not just close enough, but it's really, I mean, Iran has a lot of power within Iraq. So I think there is the need to perhaps realize simply that in the long run, ISIS will not disappear. I believe that even if militarily you can have certain actions done, I mean, such as now the bombing, or they have been sort of stopped in certain areas, yes. But you get rid of them now, let's say through force, through violence. What happens in, let's say, 2 years from now, or even 5 years from now, if the situation, the political leadership, and the political situation inside Iraq stays the same, or if the crisis in Syria is not solved? So really there is no outcome long-term unless there is a change, unless, you know, I mean, it's actually pretty basic in the end. It's people who want to just live in dignity, who want to have just the minimum. And at this moment, we cannot say that this is the case. In Iraq, it's not. In Syria, it's not either. But in Iraq, that's not the case. So just having people get jobs, not based on their Sunni or Shia identity, having people just be allowed to have a future, to not fear, and really, I mean, it's actually such a disaster that, you know, just a couple of years ago, people were not even knowing if their neighbors were Sunnis or Shia. There were some intermarriages, maybe not as many as, you know, some people claim now, but I think there was not really such an awareness of, you know, what are you, and oh, is that different from me? A lot of people even told me, oh, I didn't even know what it really meant to be Sunni or Shia. Now the fact that everything is based on that, it's a huge problem. So the political will, it's actually making compromise. It's for perhaps Iran to understand that, you know, either it will have to basically feed through, you know, militias and keep fighting for years to come, or it agrees to just let go a little bit and accept to build something that is viable in the future. What I see on the international scene really is, you know, you have Iran on the one hand that is pushing for a certain outcome, and of course there is a question of Shiism there too. And you have the Gulf states on the other hand that are trying to react to that and curb the advance, what they see as an advance of Shiism. So there is no even possibility right now for all the parties to sit together, all the parties that have really influence to sit together and, you know, and decide, you know, in the end, these are human beings, they're people who are suffering, they're people who just really need basic things. So, yeah, it's basically that's the political will, I guess, that I was talking about.